welcome to the BullCast podcast. I'm Katie Pickler, and with me today is Court Winsett.
Hello, Katie.
And Cameron Spann.
Good tidings.
And a special guest you're going to meet in a few minutes. We are having an exclusive sit-down with the Brad McMillan. Hello and welcome to BullCast. Since BullCast launched in 2020, our goal has been simple: to make personal finance approachable, engaging, and easy to understand. Over the last 300 episodes, we've covered everything from stocks, bonds, James Bond, and bonds in the market, budgeting, inheriting, retirement, planning, and so much more. But today we have a very special episode. We have the privilege of sitting down with Brad McMillan, Managing Principal, Chief Economist, Special Advisor at Commonwealth Financial Network, and the list goes on and on. Brad is one of the most respected voices in the investment industry, known for helping many make sense of this market, the economy, the big picture, the trends shaping our financial world. Brad, welcome to the BullCast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, Katie.
Perfect.
We're not worthy.
No, not at all. And I know we're going to get to it, but Court and Brad have a lot in common. And so we got to make sure that's brought up in this episode, because y'all know our Court. Our Court is our resident Eeyore.
A resident Grumpus.
Yeah,
yes.
resident Grump.
Oh, but he's a
sure.
teddy bear. You're a teddy bear.
So we normally kick off each episode with some fun pop culture, our list, but today we're doing things a little differently. Before we dive into the meat of this, the meat and potatoes, as we used to call it back in the 200s episodes, we're going to talk about Brad. We're going to ask you some few questions about you before we get into the world of investing.
This is actually, for our regular listeners, you're wondering about our list. Our list is a list of questions for Brad. So we're eschewing our normal list where we just round robin a list, and we're just going to pepper Brad with all kinds of questions. It's going to be fun. Let's see if he can keep up.
We'll ask him everything except for a social security number.
Yeah.
But our listeners will know you very well.
So what was your very first job?
I actually worked construction, laying foundations, concrete foundations for an office building. And it was in the summer in Delaware, where I'm from. So it was about 95 degrees, about 90% humidity, and I'm in a hole in the ground being yelled at.
Oh, gosh.
I've done my time in hell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not pleasant. If you could have dinner with, this is going to be a conversation. If you could have dinner with 3 historical figures, who would they be and why?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I have busts of both Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill in my study at home.
Have you met David Pickler? Do you guys know each other?
We were actually just talking about that. And on the way over, I said, is it going to be okay to mention Abraham Lincoln? And he said, yeah, I think you'll be all right.
Yes.
So,
What is your favorite movie of all time?
The Blues Brothers.
Oh, it's a good one.
Best movie ever.
So good.
The car chases, the music, just love that movie.
Is it the first Blues Brothers where they drive through the mall, or is that Blues Brothers 2000?
That was the first
Gotta
one.
be.
First one, yeah.
New Chevys are in early this year.
Do you have a favorite sports team?
I grew up outside of Philadelphia, so I grew up watching the Phillies and the Eagles. But of course, I moved to Boston, and our CEO is a huge Boston fan. So fortunately, Philly and Boston don't compete that often. So in the interim, I became a Boston fan.
Okay, very good.
What was the first thing you ever saved up money to buy?
I saved up for an amazingly cool scuba diving watch.
Oh,
This was when I was about 6 or 7, and I had to save for months for that. And it had a radium dial so you could see it in the dark. I still have that watch.
that's so awesome. How did you save?
Slowly.
Who's your favorite band or musical artist?
That's changed over time. And I think back in the day, I was a huge British band fan. The Who was probably my favorite. The Doors. As I've gotten a bit older, I've gotten away from following individual bands so much. But right now, I think Mark Knopfler is my favorite guitarist. He's done some wonderful work with Emmylou Harris, some of his post-Dire Straits work. He's just I love his tone. I love the way he plays.
I love Dire Straits. Let me add on to that question. What's the best concert you've been to? Is there one that sticks out?
For different reasons, musically, probably it's seeing Mark Knopfler in Boston. In terms of laughing, it was probably seeing Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark with my wife, because she actually started cracking up. I said, "What's going on?" She said the singer who was bouncing all over the stage, you could see the knee braces underneath his tight jeans.
Oh, that's great.
And I'm like, yeah, but God bless him. He's up there. He's my age and he's bouncing around.
Yeah, it's a gap
Do
some
what you got to do,
protection.
man.
Yep.
What you got to do.
What's one place in the world you've always wanted to visit? Of course, we talked about this last night at dinner. And I mean, is there still anywhere on the bucket list or have you been everywhere?
I've been blessed to be a lot of places. I guess I would like to go to Sharm el-Sheikh and dive in the Red Sea, which is supposed to be phenomenal. Probably also the Seychelles as well. Madagascar, I think, has unbelievably unusual wildlife. And of course, the Galapagos. I want to go to a lot of places.
Okay, good.
What's your go-to comfort food?
My mother, when I was growing up, used to make this pork chop dish, and she would it was over baked beans, and she would put thin pork chops with brown sugar and ketchup and mustard. And that is the one thing that I will make, or I will ask my wife to make when I'm feeling down.
That's awesome.
Robin's is Taco Bell. Mine is mac and cheese.
Well, see, the conference I was at recently, then we had somebody's comfort food. Bubblegum ice cream was delivered to everybody.
That's right. That was good, too.
Yes, that was Rich with LPL. It was his comfort food.
Interesting.
I took 2 of those.
It was good. I hadn't had bubblegum ice cream since I was a kid, so that was bringing back lots of memories.
I'm interested in your answer to this next question because I've never been to Boston. But for our listeners who may be visiting Boston soon, what are the must-see places you'd recommend them check out?
I think the Freedom Trail is absolutely worth a look. That'll take you through a lot of the historical sites, including some of the more recent ones like the Holocaust Memorial. The other thing I absolutely love is the USS Constitution up in the Charlestown Navy Yard. You know, I'm kind of a Navy geek, a history geek, and it's just phenomenal to walk through that and try and visualize what it was like to fight that ship. It's terrifying, absolutely terrifying.
I'd love to see it. What's the best month to visit Boston?
Probably June, because that's after the college graduations and it's a lot less crowded. The weather, it's not too hot yet, but it's still warm enough. If you want to go further up the coast, if you want to go up to Maine, you probably want to wait until July or August. But certainly the Cape and Boston in June are beautiful.
Any time of year. I would love Boston. And the food. Oh,
Not February.
Not February.
not February.
Trust me on this.
Down here, we have one big snow a year, and it's enough for me.
Yeah.
Okay, last question for you, and it's going to segue perfectly into our next section. Part of our podcast, like I said, is when we started this, it was a dual purpose. It was me getting into this business that I've been around for my entire life and trying to break down a lot of the jargon, but it was also trying to make sure my comfort level of talking about a lot of these topics, so then when I'm talking to clients, I feel like I can relate to them wherever their knowledge is. So what one piece of advice would you give to a first-time investor?
I think one thing that you need to know is when you're first putting money in is don't worry about it. It will be okay over time. Things will go up, things will go down. But if you just don't worry about it and let it sit there and don't look at it, 10, 20, 30 years from now, you'll be very, very, very glad you did.
We just need that soundbite. That is perfect. That is the bullseye right there. Boom.
And that's the tough part, isn't it? Not checking every single day, especially when you're younger. You're like, it's down, and you start to panic. I guess the last episode, how volatility is just natural, the ups and the downs.
But volatility sounds like such a negative word. So we have some questions that we've built in this list just for our listeners. We just finished a wonderful breakfast where Brad spoke, and then we had some questions from the audience. And so some of these that we have listed here, we may actually alter a little bit just from the breakfast questions. But Court, you want to start?
No. Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, before we get into that, I alluded to the Eeyore comment, but let's go ahead and address the Eeyore for both of y'all.
Address the Eeyore in the room?
Yes, address the Eeyores in the room.
I know, I guess I'll speak for myself and let Brad speak for himself. I have always just been a grumpy person, and so identify very much with Eeyore. And I really wasn't until later, maybe my 40s or so. I wasn't into Winnie the Pooh a great deal when I was a kid. So it's not like I've been carrying around Eeyore persona my entire life. But in my 30s or 40s, I just was like, that's a guy I can get behind. He's got the disposition that I like. And so, yeah, I've always said that he's one of my favorites. We all went to dinner last night, and we were discussing my predilection for Eeyore. And I mentioned something about the fact that he was my spirit animal. And David took issue with that because he pointed out that I have also been known in the past to say that polar bears are my spirit animal. And to be fair, Eeyore isn't real. So he's not a real animal. So he's kind of my imaginary spirit animal. Whereas
oh, Lord, we're just kidding.
Polar bears are my spirit animal in that they look cute and cuddly, but if you touch them, they'll kill you.
And now it's Brad's turn. As he scoots away from court.
Yeah, I'm just moving another 6 inches to the left here. I joined Commonwealth back in November of 2006. And part of my remit at the time was, all of my remit at the time was alternative investments, which included real estate. So I got a lot of questions about the housing market, and I was pretty downbeat, as you might imagine. And that didn't go over all that well among people who were less downbeat than me, which was pretty much everybody. And at one point, John and Rooney looked at me in a meeting and said, "You're just like Eeyore." And I thought, I can work with that.
Sounds good.
I took Rooney's suggestion and started embroidering around it. And it didn't actually go over well for the first, year, 18 months. But then it turned out I was right. Since then, it's been a badge of honor.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't actually consider myself an Eeyore. I go between Eeyore and Tigger, depending on the situation.
I like it.
Eeyore sells better, so we go with Eeyore.
I'm kind of like the Tigger to your Eeyore, and so we kind of meet in the middle, but definitely switching options.
Indeed.
Okay, our first question.
Well, do you think today's market has become too dependent on large tech companies? And where do you believe we are in the AI boom, still early stages, or further along than people realize? We're basically screwed, right? AI is about to take over. Data centers are here. Terminator is here. We're dead.
Yep.
And the end of the podcast.
Mic drop.
Done. Yep.
That's our final episode.
No, I think there's a couple of things going on here. We talked about this a little bit at the meeting. You need to be careful what you're talking about here. When you talk about AI, the companies you're talking about are private companies, generally speaking. Certainly, Google is doing quite a bit with it, and they have the ability to do it in-house. Microsoft, same thing. So when you talk about AI, you're really talking about it in the context of existing large, highly profitable companies from an investment standpoint. My guess would be that Anthropic and OpenAI are going to continue to break new ground. Microsoft and Google will follow very closely thereafter. So, if I was looking at it, I would say if I was going to bet on AI, I would bet on the mega cap tech firms. I think that's probably where the long-term opportunity lies. Now, that said, there are some issues evolving here. When you look at the capital spending, generally speaking, the tech companies haven't had to do that because they're software companies and they don't have tech costs. That's not purely the case with Google, of course, or anything. But now they're starting to ramp up their capital spending and they're borrowing very considerably. And that, I think, is something that means we may be past the first innings of the AI story purely from a tech perspective. Now, that said, just as with the internet, the early pets.com, .com boom and bust, that wasn't the end of the story. So I think we're still in very early innings of what AI means for companies. And I think there's a number of very potentially real upsides here. We're already starting to see it show up in some of the productivity statistics, for example. In terms of margin improvement, I think that's a real opportunity, and that actually makes me feel a lot better about current market valuations. So when you look at all that, I think we are probably past the first innings, but very early in the overall story. And of course, there's going to be good stuff and bad stuff, but we got a long ways to go yet.
On that note, on the AI note, did you guys see the flurry of graduation speech videos last week where I think the Google CEO, the Delta CEO at different universities, their commencement speech, they talked positively about AI and the students were booing. Different graduation speeches. So it's interesting is that Gen Z that just graduated? I think so. Gen Z.
I mean, we're still in Gen Z in that particular age group.
Yeah. How they're just not believers in AI yet, which is fascinating. I thought that they would be on board with it, but just boos, which was crazy. I thought that was interesting.
We've had a few conversations recently about Gen Z and the things that they don't seem to be into that other generations have traditionally been into. They seem to be, even though they were raised on it, they seem to be slightly eschewing technology, other things like that. Somebody mentioned something.
I was talking about the alcohol sales.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely
Alcohol
gone down.
sales are down for Gen Z compared to other generations.
They're just a different breed.
Yeah. Except they don't breed. That's the other thing that's down with Gen Z. Apparently, they don't like to reproduce. So That's weird.
Okay, guys, let's wrap it
I'm
up.
just saying.
Oh, you want me to ask the next one?
Are you guys really at the point where you're complaining about kids today?
Yeah, I think we are.
Getting old
Which
here.
is terrible because we've done podcast episodes talking about the different generations and trying to make sure it's always blaming the next generation. And we were like, oh, we're not going to do that. We just did that, guys.
Boomers love to hammer on millennials, and then Gen X is just lost in the sauce.
Yeah,
We
I mean,
forget about you.
I'm far closer to you in age than I am to either of these two. And
Hey, watch it.
I mean, I'm just saying, I'm a Gen X, and I walk around with a chip on my shoulder most of the time because we just tend to be ignored for the most part. Except people, especially apparently Gen Z, has started to notice us and try and call us out, and we haven't been having it.
We are bitter, feral people.
Exactly.
We were
Exactly.
raised hunting and killing our own food because our mothers were working.
Drinking water out of puddles on the sidewalk. I mean,
Gen Z wants to come for me. Give it your best shot, guys.
Cam, before you go to that next one, while we're talking about AI, what about your take on AI replacing the financial advisor?
You know, here's the thing, and we've been through this before. We've been through this with Betterment and the robo-brokers and everything. And the comparison I have given in the past was Waze.
Okay.
Remember the navigation software? And 99% of the time, Waze does everything I needed to do. And then we had an ice storm in Boston a couple of years ago, and trees were down and roads were closed. The major roads were so I'm going to use Waze and go on the back roads, except all of these roads are closed and you can't get there from here, and Waze has no clue. And it struck me, this is a great metaphor. 90% of the time, it's going to be great. But 90% of the time, you know, if you just put your money in an index fund, you'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's when things get weird. The advisors add value, that human advisors add value. And I think that is the value proposition that is not going to go away.
I like it. When things get weird, call Pickler.
Or call Brad. Kevin Warsh has now been confirmed as the next Fed chair, marking a major leadership shift at the central bank. What changes should investors expect from the Federal Reserve, and what impact could his leadership have on the U.S. economy?
Well, to start off with, I'd like to take issue with the fact that it's a major leadership shift. It is. There's no doubt about it, but certainly I think more has been made of it from kind of a horse race, not that there's anything wrong with horse races, and political perspective. At the end of the day, both Powell and Warsh are very respected, accomplished central bankers. They've both done this before, and they have the same statutory mandate in both cases. So in other words, they're both coming from the same place. They are both doing the same thing for the same reasons. So I think the differences are probably going to be more apparent than real. Now, that said, why is there this perception that things are going to be this different? Well, Warsh came in with a couple of very deliberate endorsements from the current administration. And there's certainly an expectation that he has made promises, but those promises are going to be constrained by the facts of the situation. And I think it's going to be more difficult. And certainly when you look at the appointments of every administration, when it becomes a question of the appointee's reputation versus what their appointer wants, well, they're going to protect their reputation. So I don't think the incentives are quite as aligned as people seem to think in terms of easing policy. Now, that said, when you look at Warsh's track record, there's reason to believe that he thinks AI is going to be an enormous help to productivity and is going to be deflationary overall. And that is what has been driving a lot of some of the commentary about, no, he's going to cut rates because he believes this. And I agree with basically his beliefs, but the fact is right now the other conditions are not going to allow that. So I think the impact is probably going to be much smaller than a lot of the commenters would like to believe.
What do you have to say about, am I being too flippant about my dismissal of the narrative that it's all up to Jay Powell or that it's all up to Warsh what is going to happen with interest rates? They do have to have a majority of votes from other people to decide to raise or lower rates. How much does their power play into the way the rest of the people are going to vote on an issue like that?
Very little, actually, because the chair typically has undue influence, as they should. But at the same time, as you say, it really is a voting situation. And what often happens is a consensus emerges and the chair, so as not to lose the clout, the perception of clout, aligns with the perception. In other words, there's definitely some leading going on from the chair, but there's also a certain amount of following. Mm-hmm. So historically, that's been the case. Now, going forward, we've seen more dissents recently. Some of that consensus is starting to break down. And certainly when you look at Jay Powell is remaining on the committee, even though he's no longer chair, there's the potential, I emphasize the word potential, for there to be another center of power for dissent to coalesce around. So I think Warsh probably is a little bit more constrained in trying to drive an agenda than he would otherwise be.
I think that's a pretty common misperception about the Fed chair is, they're not up there just making all the decisions.
It's kind of like everybody thinking that the president just makes all the decisions and it's not, there's a whole system in place.
Right.
The other thing I would actually add on to that is when you say the Federal Reserve sets interest rates, that is both true and incomplete. They set short-term interest rates, but longer-term rates are set by the market. Now, that being the case, the Fed tries to jawbone longer-term rates by making hints about later policy. And to the extent that Warsh's ability to impose policy is constrained, that may negatively affect his ability to jawbone longer-term rates. And that's a real impact. It may well be showing up right now.
Well, I would say the next question, I just want to point out, it's got some references, and we've actually been making some references that I feel comfortable talking about to our audience because they're things that we've talked about on this podcast before. And we've even talked about on this podcast before, is the dollar dead or not, in a very broad sense. But this next question gets into some details, so let's make sure we define the terms that we're using as we go along. Who wants to ask it?
So the U.S. dollar has long been the world's reserve currency, but there's increasing conversation about its future. If the dollar continues to weaken, what impact could that have on the economy and the markets? Do you believe there's any real possibility the dollar could eventually lose its reserve currency status?
So first, let's talk about what does that mean when we say the dollar is the world's reserve currency? Let's define that.
A reserve currency is one that other countries hold as a store of value. A reserve currency is one that is the primary means of exchange. The advantage to a country of having the reserve currency is they can print it whenever they need to. In other words, there will always be a market for their currency. They don't need to trade their currency for something else. And that is indeed a very significant advantage. Now, that said, there are also costs to that, because essentially you give up the ability to manage your exchange rate. In other words, you can't manage your exchange rate to help to move other parts of the economic machine. So there are costs and there are benefits, but overall the benefits substantially outweigh the costs. The U.S. dollar has been the reserve currency pretty much since World War II, certainly since the 1970s. So we get a lot of good out of it.
Does the fact that we are the reserve currency, I've never asked this question before, so bear with me. Does the fact that we are the reserve currency have anything to do with the fact that we used to be on the gold standard and we stopped that particular tie of the dollar to the gold?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
It's simply a question of we are the dominant economy. We are the dominant political power. To an underappreciated degree, it's the reserve currency because we have guaranteed the global trading system. In other words, not only have we been the largest market, not only have we been one of the largest economies, we are also the one organization that you really don't want to get upset with you because we're protecting you in all of your trade around the world.
So I'd love to get your take. I know you just talked about it at the breakfast, but a lot of our clients will reach out to us and ask questions about, the cashless society and then cryptocurrency. Is that going to be replacing cash?
Those are two different things. Cryptocurrency, the way it's currently configured, is emerging as a separate asset class. As I said, I was largely agnostic. Well, I was doubtful about it, but agnostic. And I think Bitcoin at this point has largely faked it until it made it. So I think Bitcoin is going to be with us. The rest of them, maybe, maybe not. It's unsure at this point. Now, that's separate from what's called a central bank digital currency, which would be digital cash issued and controlled by the central bank of a country. And that is something that, in theory, could replace cash. Again, there's a bunch of policy reasons to do that. The principal reason not to do it is because it gives the government absolute insight into all of your financial life. Tax collection becomes easy. And from a libertarian perspective, that would be anathema. And there are large parts of both parties that are very much against that. So politically, I don't see that flying, but they are two different questions.
Okay.
Brad, I'm assuming part of your job is reviewing hundreds, potentially thousands of data points. Which one do you focus on most Like, what would you say is a red flag or what keeps you up at night? Is there a singular data point?
The most important one to me is job growth. But I want to expand on that a little bit because when you look at any data point, there's a number of lenses you can look at it. Typically what we get is this is what happened last month. I don't care what happened last month. There's a lot of noise. I want to see year-on-year numbers. That is a useful metric. So when you look at, for example, monthly job numbers, that's interesting. Year-on-year job numbers, that actually has significance as a signal of where the economy is going. Same thing with consumer sentiment. And actually, there's 4 metrics I look at as a signal of a recession. One is job growth year on year. The other is consumer sentiment changes year on year. The third is business confidence change year on year. And the fourth is interest rate changes. Those are the different metrics that actually meaningfully indicate whether we have an economic problem coming up. And right now, none of them are flashing red.
That's very helpful.
Court, what you got?
One of the things that you mentioned earlier when you were talking this morning was the job number that you're looking at. It. Generally speaking, you said, if it's over 50,000 or 50,000 or above, then we're doing okay generally. Is that 50,000 or above new jobs year on year? Is that
No, that's a monthly
That's a monthly figure?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And the reason I say that is we're typically adding between 50 and 100,000 workers per month. So if we're running ahead of that, then the labor market essentially is holding steady or at least not weakening too much.
Okay. All right. Next question. Many of the traditional recession indicators investors have relied on have flashed warning signs, not recently necessarily, but a few years ago, we had some big red flashing lights that would be generally considered indicators of a recession, but the recession didn't happen. A recession hasn't been declared by those people on high who declare such things. Are those indicators still reliable? I know you've basically just gone through your list of indicators. Has there been any shift in what people look at in the past, decade? Or is it still pretty consistent with what people have always looked at?
Well, those 4 that we just talked about have not changed. What has changed is when you look at, for example, consumer sentiment, there's 2 different surveys. And what's become apparent over time is one is better than the other at predicting future outcomes. That's the Conference Board survey. So, there's some evolution in how you measure things. Certainly as the data evolves, one of the interesting things, you hear a lot about the inverted yield curve as a signal of recession. And in fact, if you go back and look at the data, it's not when the yield curve inverts, when it uninverts. That's actually the signal. So again, there's been some evolution of how those signals can be interpreted based on more data. But the one thing that I find interesting is we used to track year-on-year oil price changes as an indicator of trouble. And what happened was oil prices went low and stayed low. So any changes were still within kind of that, within the risk-free zone. So we dropped that as an indicator, and that's something I think we may well be bringing back, simply because we're now seeing oil prices move back into the risk zone. That said, I'm not sure about that because the U.S. Economy is much less oil intensive than it's been. But that's something we're looking at.
Court, I want to ask him the question that we had from a couple of clients, but it was regarding around SpaceX and Anthropic and the worry that once those go public, it's going to have a huge impact on the S&P 500 and all those big stocks. So what are you seeing in your crystal ball?
Well, the thing is, I do actually have a crystal ball, and what people don't realize is essentially a big rock. It weighs a ton, and my parents got it for me, but the damn thing doesn't work. So that actually is a concern I share because right now the indices are kind of bending over backwards to incorporate some of these hypercap stocks earlier than they otherwise would. And that historically has not been a good sign. So that is a worry I share. And honestly, it's still up in the air, but it is something to keep an eye on. Okay. I don't have any hard data at this point.
Cam, you got another question?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull it up. Hang on. It was from the other day.
Your call is very important to us.
Reminds me of the Butterball episode.
Well,
we actually called the Butterball hotline for a Thanksgiving episode.
This is more personal to me, so I'm not sure how much our listeners are really going to be interested in this. But when I started in the industry in 1984, most information was held by advisors. Now there's so much more information out there that instead of clients having to go to advisors to get the data, they have to go to advisors to help analyze the data. What tools do you use? Now, caveat, obviously, I didn't start in the industry in 1984. This was actually originally actually a question posed by David, but I am very interested in the answer. What tools are you using to analyze the data?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you, I spent decades figuring out what actually matters. And we just had that discussion about the economy. We can have that discussion about the markets, what matters, why it matters, what you should want. So I actually spent most of my time triaging, getting rid of the stuff that doesn't matter over time. I've also kind of accepted that most stuff is noise and there's a limit to how much you can predict. So that being the case, I have kind of gone to a more less is more approach. I don't spend a ton of time analyzing a bunch of different data. I spend a lot of time thinking about what the data that matters means. And I think that's a different approach. And most of the, you'll see a million publications, this is what this means, we've analyzed this, yada, yada, yada. But what I actually read myself is people thinking about what the data means rather than trying to analyze it and extract meaning from it.
My final question for you. How much of economic confidence is psychological versus structural?
That's a really interesting question. And the question would be, how do you even start to address that issue? That is a useful framework for starting to think about the difference in the results of the two consumer surveys I mentioned. Because as I said, the Conference Board survey, which is a better indicator, does seem to be more structurally driven, whereas the Michigan survey seems to be more psychologically or vibe driven, and it's a less useful indicator going forward for economic performance. So that could certainly argue that what you're seeing is a structurally determined economy where the psychology cycles up and down. And that actually would also be consistent with other things where you see a lot of the softer data, the survey data, fairly consistently contradicting the harder data. I would say probably quite a bit of consumer sentiment is psychological, but it doesn't seem to be all that economically determinative. That seems to be more based on fundamentals. That's a really interesting way to look at it. Good question.
Oh, thank you.
We've talked a ton on this podcast about behavioral finance and why people do what they do. But as you were talking that, I think about it, there's a lot of people that make a lot of noise, but then what they're actually doing contradicts the noise they're making.
Precisely right. Oh, the world's going to hell, but I just bought a new boat.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, the national debt continues to rise. Interest payments are taking up growing shares of federal spending. How come the government can keep having all this debt, but debt for the general public, it's not a good thing?
Well, the argument historically has been, yes, but it's basically eternal debt. We never have to pay it back. The country will continue. The economy is growing. And all of that's true. And if you look at, for example, Japan has historically been the counterexample for we're going to have a train wreck. Because Japan has been in this situation for decades and they're doing okay. Okay, fair enough. And I think that's a defensible argument, and it may well indeed turn out to be correct. Certainly it has so far. But that said, I do think we are starting to get close to a break point. And what's interesting about that is typically seen as the end of the world. I don't think so. Because again, the question becomes, yes, it's a problem. Is it a solvable problem? And there are other things we can do to solve the problem. Now, none of them are good. There is no good solution, and any solution will be painful. And what typically happens in Washington, and we've seen this over and over again, is a problem will persist until the pain of the solution is less than the pain of the problem. Right now, there is no real pain in the problem that would force government, that would force Congress to act and solve the problem. So unfortunately, we're going to have to see quite a bit of economic pain before they are forced to solve the problem. The good news is it is a solvable problem.
Booyah. I got nothing.
I think the other thing we should touch on is you spoke about the global impact and really kind of talking about the states versus other countries. Can you kind of explain that to everybody?
Sure. One of the questions is you're going to have knock-on effects around the world of everything that's going on right now. The Strait of Hormuz is the current crisis du jour, but it's always something. And the question is, well, how is this going to affect the United States? Well, let's start with the rest of the world. This really is a big deal, okay? You're running out of oil, supplies are going low. You're going to see large parts of the world where potentially it's not a question of can they afford the oil, it's there just isn't any to be afforded. And it's not just oil, it's fertilizer, it's helium, it's all of these other knock-on things that basically we could end up with food crises we haven't seen in decades. So it is an enormous big deal, especially for poorer countries. And you're already seeing governments around the world start to react to that. And I don't want to minimize that. That said, here in the U.S., we are a wealthy country. We have our own shore fertilizer and hydrocarbon production facilities. We have our own water. We don't have military threats on our borders. The U.S. is is certainly the most economically independent of all the major economies. Again, we're not completely isolated, but we are much more isolated than anybody else, and we are much more self-sufficient than anybody else. So if anybody is well positioned to ride this out, it's us. So will there be an effect? Yes, quite possibly. Will it be severe? It might. Will it be crippling? It doesn't look that way, not here in the U.S.
Perfect. Anything else you want to share with us?
This has been a great session, bunch of great questions. I think the one thing I would say, and this ties back to what would I tell young investors, is over time, it'll be okay. We were talking earlier about war in the Middle East. I am 60 years old. I don't think there's been a time in my life when there hasn't been war in the Middle East. When we talk about Russia threatening Europe and everything else, again, I don't think there's a time in my life when that hasn't been the case. I remember going out and doing duck and cover drills in the hallway. I remember having nightmares about nuclear annihilation. I've lived through AIDS. I've lived through the pandemic. I've lived through a bunch of different wars. When I talk to investors around the country, there's typically, okay, Obama was elected, the economy is going to hell, I'm selling everything and moving abroad. Okay, Trump was elected, different set of people. I'm selling everything and moving abroad. Back to the first set for Biden, same thing, back to the same set for Trump too. It's going to be okay. We'll figure it out. It's not going to be fun maybe, but we're going to be okay. And I think that's something that we all need to remember.
Absolutely.
That didn't sound like Eeyore. That sounded...
yeah, that was helpful.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That was great.
No, Cam and David put together an incredible marketing piece that was how to survive a bear attack. And it was about a bear market. And it really was just kind of that old rules. If you think about it, if you encounter a bear, maybe it's Quartz polar bear, but just, don't panic, stick with your plan. You're going to be okay. And I have noticed that coming into this industry, Dad's been doing this for so long, that times when I've had friends who are not investing with us, then they go, oh, everything's going crazy, or your phone's blowing up. Is everybody panicking? And I'm like, you know what? No, because our clients know, we've talked to them, we've explained this to them, and they understand this is noise. This is something we're going to stick to our path. It's going to be okay. And I remember the first time I really sat back and realized that everyone else was kind of panicking, and our clients are fine because we've told them, we've talked to them about it. And that's what this podcast is that we want to empower the people understand, because there's so much information out there. This day and age where people are getting their news from TikTok and Reels and things like that we don't have all the answers. But if we can help you digest all this information and try and find what's important. And I loved when you were talking about it's looking at the information, but just thinking, because I think critical thinking is something that a lot of people are not utilizing anymore. We're relying too much on AI to think for us and tell us, and we're not taking that time to look at the data and say, is this right? How do I think about this? What do I feel about this?
And I will say everything you said is a sign of an outstanding financial advisor.
Oh, don't make me blush, Eeyore.
And there is our bullseye for the day. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, there's the closing bell. You have made it to the end of yet another episode of the BullCast podcast. If you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, please feel free to go to your favorite subscription service and sign up to have our podcast delivered directly to your device every single Thursday at noon. If you'd like to find out more about Cortland, Katie, Cameron, or Nicole, please feel free to go to our website. That website is bullcastpodcast.com. We've got our bios up there, we've got pictures, and we've got a place where you can drop a comment or suggest a topic you'd like to hear us talk more about. But hey, I mentioned pictures. We do have pictures on Instagram, and our Instagram handle is @BullCastPodcast. We also have an X handle, which is also @BullCastPodcast, and we have a Facebook page, which is BullCast the Podcast. But, ladies and gentlemen, as I like to mention every single episode, Katie, Cameron, Nicole, and I all work at a place called Pickler Wealth Advisors. And if you'd like to find out even more about us, find out about what we do, find out about what we could do for you, find out about our amazing team, or find out about our boss, David Pickler, please feel free to go to that website. That website is picklerwealthadvisors.com.
That's advisors with an O.
Not an E.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have given you everything you need, except it really hasn't been me. So thanks again to our guest, Brad McMillan.
Woo!
Brad, is there anything you'd like to say before I take us out?
Always a pleasure, my friends.
Thank you for being here. It's really been a pleasure and a joy. So I guess that's the end. For now, I'm Court.
I'm Katie.
I'm Cam.
That's Brad.
Bye.
Thank you, Brad. And we're done.